Affairs. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank. We are based in Kenya, and our work is to basically establish a platform for public discourse on topical issues affecting Kenya, the region, and the globe. The interest of the IEA is to generate research, ideas, and dialogue that promotes prosperity regionally, domestically, and globally. And for that reason, to generate choices that allow the governments to make choices that are consistent with the enhancement of public welfare in terms of higher incomes, more secure society, and obviously a more stable and effective democracy. Now, in the last week, or rather, our webinar for today will be quite salient because it discusses something that has been evident on this continent over the last couple of weeks regarding conflicts in some parts of Africa, which have just generally tended to be, of the continent, which have tended to be, have become more intense or more salient more recently. But more particularly, one of the things that we do every year is the Institute of Economic Affairs interacts or allows a platform like this to create conversations around what the Fund for Peace, which is a global think tank, publishes the Fragile State Index every year. And we're not too sure for whatever reason, but the 2025 edition of the Fragile State Index, which ranks societies globally in terms of the degree of fragility, has not been published. Regardless of that, we still think this is a conversation that we should have, because not only is this a finding that we think is important, one, for fostering effective democracies and prosperity, economic prosperity of citizens, is dependent on government and good governance providing solid public goods. One of the biggest parts of solid public goods is to provide personal security, but also to secure people's lives, people's property, and obviously peace in general. So the meeting today is called The Silent Siege, Unpacking the Economic Cost of Kenya's Fragility. And so we are coming from two parts. The normative argument by many people is that basically peace is a requirement in society, which is important. Many times we make the leap by arguing that it is also an economic good, or rather, peace is a public good that allows for economic prosperity, and we think that that is also true. So what you're trying to do today is to connect both by providing a bridge between the normative requirements for peace, which everybody appreciates, and the fact that it is also a critical part for ensuring not just medium term, but longer term and sustaining prosperity for generations or for a population. So to do that, we are asking ourselves the same and looking at some global benchmarks or global indices or methodologies that measure peace, governance, effectiveness, which of course whose basic outcome will be peace, and then to ask ourselves what they teach us more generally, and then come back to situate that in Kenya and ask ourselves what are the costs or benefits that we gain from government's effectiveness in providing a peaceful atmosphere or a peaceful country. So today I have two of my colleagues from the Popular Economics Program, and my two colleagues, Vivian Ochola and Maureen Barasa. Vivian Ochola is an assistant program officer. Maureen Barasa is a program officer in the Popular Economics Program. And they'll be going through two specific methodologies or publications, one done by the OECD, which is basically measuring states of fragility among countries, and highlight from that, pull out nuggets of what it tells us, the findings, the nuggets of what it tells us, and what are its applications specifically to Kenyans at this moment. Perhaps the region as well, of course, that will be useful. And then the second part of this conversation will go to, we'll be extracting the report for this year for the Institute for Economics of Peace, who published the Global Peace Index, and again pull from those specific nuggets and insights, and then zero into what the costs of the absence of peace or violence in some pockets or whichever ways in which they occur, what are the costs that it does, and the economic, quite apart from the personal and social costs, the economic costs substantial. And the idea therefore is to find out, to try and persuade ourselves about why peace on the normative side is acceptable. I think it is one thing that is essential, and it is often one of the reasons why strengthening governance and strengthening governance and government effectiveness is not by the robustness and expenditure on military or expenditure on huge police forces, which is something that we've seen in Kenya quite a bit, but actually in the investment in the infrastructure of good governance, which are a whole set of things that government needs to do. Hopefully after that, then we'll ask for your conversations. So for your comments. So we'll provide links to all the studies in addition to this presentation after this. But I ask us before we go to the presentation to adhere to just two rules. One, please keep your microphones muted and your cameras as well switched off, so that we can have one presentation. So we can focus on, we can have one presentation and focus on the presentation. And after the 40 minutes of presentation, which I'll adhere to strictly, then we'll open up to a question and answer. So that's the first. And the second thing is, please note that this webinar is being recorded. It is not recorded for any other reason except for our archival purposes. We tend to use it for public education, and other people make reference to it, those who are unable to attend at this time. So with those two, I'd like to open up by asking my colleague Vivian to commence her presentation. Vivian will have 20 minutes. At the end of 20 minutes, I'll alert you so that you can allow for Maureen to follow up with that conversation without break. So here you go.
I'll take you through the first segment or the first case study. But before that, let us see the outline. So the outline is composed of 4 components. We have the rationale. Why are we doing this study? Or why are we doing this webinar? And also the methodology. So because we are using 2 tools, we are going to get the methodology for each tool. Then we have the empirical evidence. What are some of the data or the facts that we are going to get? Then finally, the conclusion and recommendations. So that is the outline of this webinar. Now, for the rationale, the reason we are undertaking the study or we are doing the webinar is because peace and stability of countries are connected to prosperity and economic performance. So you need to understand that when a country is peaceful and stable, then it will prosper and also it will perform well economically. So it is closely connected. Then this study connects the normative to the positive reasoning. So we realize that people have feelings about the economy and all that, but we want to try to connect it to facts and data so that the two can really connect. So that is the rationale of this webinar. Now I'll take you through case study 1, and we'll be using data from OECD, States of Fragility 2025. This is our source of information. Now, the introduction. So what is fragility? We need to understand what fragility is so that as we go on, you have that background. So fragility is basically a combination of exposure to risk and in the insufficient resilience of a state, a system or a community to manage, absorb, and mitigate those risks. So when you combine this exposure to risk, the insufficient resilience, that makes a community maybe lack the ability to manage and also absorb and mitigate risks. So that is what is fragility. So we are going to understand throughout this section what are the causes of fragility and what are some of the consequences of fragility. So we have the methodology and the facts. So according to the EOCD data, it assesses 177 countries. In the analysis, they use contexts, but for this we'll use countries. So it assesses 177 countries using 56 indicators across 6 dimensions. And the 6 dimensions are economic, environmental, political, security, societal, and human. So we realize that in all these 6 dimensions, fragility can be caused by the economic factors, by environmental factors, by political factors. So all these 6 dimensions contributes to fragility of a particular economy. And for the facts that we get in from the data or from the analysis, it tells us that the analysis focuses on 61 countries. And the reason for this is because 43 of these countries are experiences high fragility, and 18 experiences extreme fragility. And these 61 countries also represent 25% of the world's population. And again, these 61 countries also have the highest of a percentage of 72% of the world's extreme poor. So this implies that fragility is connected to poverty. So the more fragile a country is, the more poor that country is. So we are going to understand throughout the session how can that be? How is fragility connected to poverty? So of this 25% of the world's population, they carry the huge number of the extreme world's poor people. So if you take 100 people coming from extreme and high fragile states, 72% or 72 of them are extremely poor. Then another fact is that these extreme and high fragile countries, they also generates and hosts majority of the world's displaced. So people who run away from their country because of maybe war, famine, and all that, they majorly comes from this high and extreme fragility. And again, they also host these people that are being displaced. So they generate and basically host the world's displaced. So those are some of the facts and methodology of this study. Now we want to go to the causes of fragility. Let us see some of the things that causes fragility in a country. So the first one is autocracy. So autocracy is basically a system whereby a system of government where one person or a small group holds the absolute power. So in this type of system or this type of a government, it can lead to efficient decision, but at the cost of individual freedom. So people are not consulted in making choices in that particular country. Then for democracy, this is where citizens have voice in decision making, and it is characterized by voting rights and also freedom and fairness in elections. So basically, annually, the Economic of Intelligence Unit rank countries based on their democracy, their level of democracy. And when you look at the result in 2024, we realize that Kenya was number 89 when it comes to democracy, and also it was slightly below the global index. Now, that is just a background. Now, when we go to our chart, the y-axis shows us the liberal democracy index, and it is rated from 0 to 100, 0 being the least or the lowest, then 100 being the highest. So a country that has got 100 means that it is a democratic country. Then the x-axis represent fragility score from 0 all the way to 100, 0 for a country with a lower fragility to 100 for a country that has extreme to high fragility. So we are seeing on the scatter plot, we are able to note the orange dots are for autocracy, then the green dots are for democracy. So we are able to see there's an inverse relationship between democracy and fragility. So it shows that the higher the level of democracy, the lower the fragility, and vice versa. So we are able to note that countries that are experiencing autocracy, their level of democracy is low as 0%. So we are able to note that there's a strong correlation between freedom of countries and their fragility. So if a country is experiencing autocracy, then basically it implies that it will be fragile. So there's that inverse relationship. So the higher the fragility, or the lower the level of democracy, the higher the fragility. Yeah. Then another cause of fragility is government ineffectiveness. So just a little background, we are able to know that government effectiveness basically measures the quality of public services and civil services. So in other terms, it is the ability of the government to deliver services, to implement policies, and to achieve desired outcomes. So a government is effective if it can deliver services very well, implement very good policies so that they achieve a desired outcome. So we are able to see in chart 2, we are able to note the correlation between government effectiveness and fragility. So the y-axis is the government effectiveness that is rated from 0 to 100. 0 is the least effective and 100 the most effective government. Then for the x-axis, we are seeing aggregate fragility score from 0 all the way to 100. So, and we are having extreme fragility, the blue dots, then high fragility, the orange dot, then green for medium to low fragility. So we are able to note something. There's also an inverse relationship between government effectiveness and fragility. So it shows that governance affects fragility. And we are able to see here that the extreme fragile countries are concentrated at the bottom. They are concentrated at the bottom, and even the high fragility, they are also at the bottom. So it implies that the more a government is ineffective, the more it is fragile. So we are able to note, if you are keen enough, we are able to see that there's no mix up here. You can't find a high fragile country with an effective government. You can't see the orange dot inside the green dot. So we are seeing the flow. So ineffectiveness really causes fragility of a particular country, as it is noted in the scatter graph we have. Then thirdly, we have gender inequality. So it is noted that gender inequality is one of the root causes of fragility. So in chart 3, we have the gender inequality index on the y-axis and the aggregate fragility score on the x-axis. So just a bit background, how gender inequality index. So gender inequality index is a composite of metric of gender inequality that uses 3 dimensions. So the 3 dimensions we have is reproductive health, we have empowerment and labor market. So it comprises of those three dimensions. So we are able to know that the lower the index, the lower the inequality. So it means that when it is at 0, there's no inequality, so there's equality. Then, so we are able to note that there's a positive correlation between gender inequality and fragility. So the lower the inequality, the lower the fragility, and vice versa. So we are able to note that countries that are experiencing high fragility, to the further right, you are able to know that they are having high level of gender inequality. So it has got a positive relation. So gender inequality is a major contributor when it comes to fragility of a country. Now, let us see the consequences. So we have seen how governance, how lack of freedom and inequality contributes to fragility. Now, let us see what are now the consequences of fragility. So the first one is low GDP. So chart 4 shows the median GDP per capita annual growth for different contexts from 2001 to 2021. So the y-axis is GDP per capita growth, the annual GDP per capita growth. Then we have the years on the x-axis. So the blue line is for extreme fragility, the orange line is for high fragility, then we have medium to low, then medium to low ODA eligible, and medium to low not ODA eligible. So we are able to note, if you are keen enough, you're able to note that the blue line, the extreme fragility, or countries with extreme fragility, their economic or their GDP has been low over the period of time, and it has been fluctuating. When you look at the period 2009, where we had the global financial crisis, The countries that were affected are countries that are medium to low fragility, that experiences or that are eligible to ODA. So this is basically because there was a financial crisis and there was no support. That's why they curve or they experienced that a great shock. But we are able to note over the period of time, high fragility countries are experiencing low growth. And another thing, when you look at 2020, during COVID-19, we're able to note both of the countries were affected because it was a global shock, but the recovery was slow for the countries that experiences extreme fragility and high fragility. So the reason why we are not seeing, for example, in 2009, why we are not seeing the shock very much on those countries, because they have got limited exposure to global credit and inflow. So that's why they were not much affected during the financial crisis. The countries that experience extreme fragility and high fragility, then they also are largely disconnected to the financial network. But we are able to note after COVID-19 that they were slow to recover. So because when a country is fragile, it means that when a shock happens, then recovery process is very slow. And we are able to notice throughout the years from 2020 to 2021, their GDP did not resume to normal GDP as quickly as other countries that are not fragile. Then another consequence is high inflation. So chart 5 basically shows medium inflation for different contexts, and we have medium inflation on the y-axis, then the years on the x-axis. So we are able to note that the orange and the blue lines that represent extreme and high fragile states are experiencing high inflation, or they are having high inflation over the period of times. So this can be, as a result, remember we understood that one of the causes of fragility is weak governance of poor government or government ineffectiveness. So because of this weak institution, they also experiences poor fiscal discipline. So when government can't raise enough revenue or even pay off debts, what fragile and extreme fragile country do is basically they opt to print more money, like what happened is recently in South Sudan and Zimbabwe. So they print more money, and as they print more money, it leads to inflation. And that is why we're able to see these countries are experiencing high inflation rate as compared to countries that are having medium to low fragility. Then lastly, we have remittance dependence. So remittance is basically money that people working abroad send back to support their families at home. So we're able to note from the data, it showed that remittances accounted for 10% of GDP in 14 countries that experiences high to extreme fragility. That was in 2023. Then it also an important source of foreign exchange. So the table on the right, table 1, shows basically the top 5 countries with highest remittances. Then we added some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, then Kenya. So we are able to note that the first 5 countries, a greater percentage of their GDP is from remittances. Like we have Tajikistan at 31%, Lebanon at 30%. Then when it comes to South Sudan, it is at 15%, Somalia at 14%, Kenya is a bit low at 3.8%. Then when you look at the third column is their FSI scores. And we are able to know that these countries over the period of times have been having a low score. So they are very extreme to high fragile countries. So they are more dependent on remittances. So why? Why is this so? So we noted that they have poor governance, and as a result, the government is hostile in these countries. So they experience a lot of instability, and this tends to suppress the factors of production in those particular countries, hence creating less job opportunities. So people tend to run away from these countries that are experiencing extreme to high fragility. They tend to run away and want to work outside the country. So as they want to work outside the country, so we realize these that because many people now work outside the country, that makes it possible for a greater percentage of their GDP to be from remittances. Because there are less opportunity within the countries, people opt for jobs that are outside the country, so they tend to send back for those who remain in the country support through the remittances. So that is the major reason why this country are remittance dependent. They lack opportunities, and people now go outside to work outside, then they send back something home, and it contribute to the GDP of those particular countries. So that's all for the case study one. We have seen the rationale, we have seen the causes of fragility and some of the consequences of fragility. So I'll invite my colleague to take us through the next case study. Thank you.
So we'll be going through the second case study, which is basically unpacking the Global Peace Index for 2025. And this is just the source of our information for today. And yeah, we're trying to blend the findings from the Global Peace Index for 2025 with Kenya-specific violence and fragility diagnostics to produce a practical, fiscal roadmap. So why do we analyze the Global Peace Index? First and foremost, if we can tie it back to the first bit of the presentation, peace influences interest rates, investor risk premium, and public investment. Why do we say so? If someone is lending to a country which is highly fragile, the chances of them getting paid back might be low, or maybe a default might happen. So this means high interest rates on the fragile country. It also, the risk premium, which is basically the interest rates that these investors, or rather lenders, tend to use as a buffer in case of a default or no repayment, and also public investments. I believe each and every business person would want to invest in a country which is peaceful, to ensure high returns and also sustainability of their businesses. And secondly, violence and instability impose recurring GDP and fiscal costs. We've seen one of the consequences of fragility being low GDP growth. So violence and instability lead to low GDP growth. I'll give an example of Kenya. If we come back to Kenya, the GDP growth for 2023 was 5.6%. And in 2024, where we had the generational protest that happened in June 2024, okay, I'm not attributing the GDP growth rates to the protests, but given everything else that happened in that year, GDP growth reduced from 5.6% to 4.7% in 2024. And there's also fiscal costs which are tied to debt servicing costs. Then lastly, the reason as to why we analyze the GPI, okay, I'll be using GPI, which means Global Peace Index. Institutions and attitudes correlates with resilience. So the stability of a country and positive peace have a positive correlation. So in case there's violence and instability, we tend to have we tend to have negative peace in that case. So moving forward, we'll be looking at the introduction of the reports. That is the Global Peace Index 2025. This was the 19th edition. We have like different editions that have been produced each year, and we'll be making a comparison over the years, or maybe from the previous year. And it ranks 163 independent states and territories according to their level of peacefulness. So that is 99.7% of the world's population. And this report is normally done and prepared by the Institute for Economics and Peace. It's based in Sydney, and that is the Global Peace Index. It's the world's leading measure of global peacefulness. So they look at different metrics, which we'll discuss later, to come up with different scores for different countries on their peacefulness and the globe as a whole. So it uses 23 qualitative and quantitative indicators to measure the state of peace across 3 domains. So these 23 qualitative and quantitative indicators are categorized in 3 major domains. That is the level of societal safety and security, the extent of ongoing domestic and international conflicts, and lastly, the degree of militarization. So for the level of societal safety and security, maybe they look at the homicide rates, internal conflicts, among other things. Then the extent of ongoing domestic and international conflict, either there's violence and conflicts between neighboring countries, and also the degree of militarization, how much is spent on military budgets and the impact of it. So for methodology, these are the indicator weights that I mentioned in the previous slides. We had 23 indicators that are categorized into 2 broad categories. Again, that is the internal peace indicators and external peace indicators, and the weights are done from 1 to 5. The internal peace indicators cater for 60% of the score. Then for the external peace indicators cater for 40% of the score. So just the top 5 for internal peace indicators, that is perceptions to criminality, which gives a score of 3, then security officers and police rates, which gives a score of 3, homicide rates, a score of 4, incarceration rates, a score of 3. We have other things like maybe terrorism, weapon imports, political terror, political instability, violent crime, and violent demonstration. So all those indicators are the ones that are used to get the 60% for internal peace. Then for external peace, that is majorly military expenditure, peacekeeping and funding, weapon exports, refugees and IDPs, neighboring countries' relations, external conflict sports. So that caters for the 40%, and they all have different weights as indicated there. So we've already seen the methodology and how the numbers are computed. So we'll focus on Kenya's numbers and the domain scores across the 3 that you mentioned. So for ongoing domestic and international conflict domain, in 2025, Kenya got a score of 2.384. So it's worth noting before we go ahead, all scores for each indicators are put on a scale of 1 to 5. So the closer a score is towards 5 on the number scale, that means a country score has a less peaceful score on the particular domain, or rather a country is less peaceful. So for societal safety and security domain, Kenya had a score of 2.73, which was the highest among the 3 scores. And the report indicated that countries with higher per capita income tend to score better on societal safety domain. So there's a positive correlation between higher per capita income and societal safety domain, and we'll narrow down as to how peace and public finance correlate. Then there's the militarization domain of 1.855, which was the lowest. Then just to mention, the Fragile States Index of 2024, which looked at the 2023 numbers, labeled Kenya as one of the countries with high warning in terms of fragility. And also, the societal safety and security domain correlates strongly with the economic stress that a country faces, which leads to violence and fragility. So we've looked at Kenya's case. So this is the Sub-Saharan Africa Peace Corps. Those were the domains. Now we look at the major peace corps for different countries and compare it to the Sub-Saharan average, which is shaded in green. That is on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, those are the scores for each country. So the countries that were below the Sub-Saharan Africa average were Ghana, Botswana, and Mauritius, which had a score of less than 2, all of them. Then Kenya was slightly above that of the Sub-Saharan Africa average with 2.392. And this was a deterioration from the previous year, where Kenya had a score of 2.345. So the score on peace for Kenya deteriorated from 2023, and it got worse in 2024. And we had the other countries which were above that of the Sub-Saharan Africa average were Ethiopia, Nigeria, and South Sudan. So this is just to say it signals macroeconomic risks in a country. So it's either the policies, the fiscal policies that the country sets, or the monetary policies. And if you can remember why there were generational protests in Kenya last year, it was majorly due to a tax increase, which the government was trying to justify. It was due to the debt distress, and it was trying to increase taxes so that they can be able to cater for debts and also salaries. So we've looked at the scores. Now we are looking at Kenya's case, how violence and public finance interact. So looking at 2024 numbers from the draw, public debt stood at 11.3 trillion, that is 62.8% of GDP. Currently, if you check the IA's debt clock, it's on the IA's website. The public debt has surpassed the 12 trillion mark, and with the ballooning, or rather the increased debt distress, it raises the rollover and debt servicing costs. Because okay, in the current past, the government has been trying to borrow more domestically, and as you all know, domestic debt has high interest rates and shorter maturity. So with that, it increases the debt servicing cost, and the debt servicing itself in 2024, it consumed at 76% of revenue. This means for every 100 shillings that's being collected, 76 shillings is used to service debt. And this in itself crowds out public goods and services, because if maybe 76 or say 80 shillings of what's collected is used to repay debt, what's left for public services and goods? And by public goods, you mean things like security And we also have private goods with positive externalities like education, health. Yeah, so what's left to finance or rather fund those goods and services by the government is very little. And people tend to feel the pinch because maybe salaries will be delayed, there's less income, maybe there might be loss of jobs, privatization or merging of parastatals. And also, if we look at the county sides, there's county transfer delays. We've seen conferences, or rather press meetings with at the Council of County Governors trying to say they had less disbursement of county funds, and we've seen nurses on strike from different counties because of late payments. Yeah, so this procyclical local austerity and it leads to procyclical local austerity and devolved service gaps, because if we're paying Q1 salaries in Q4 or rather Q3, it creates fiscal distress among counties, and this tends to undermine positive peace. So next we'll be looking at the austerity unrest, and this is a self-reinforcing fiscal loop. So if we look at the figure on the right, and if we start at the fiscal consolidation stage, that is like at the center on your right, fiscal consolidation. If you remember from the webinar that we did, we described fiscal consolidation as either increasing revenue or cutting on expenditure, and also it might involve something such as privatization. So with increase of revenue or cutting on expenditure, or maybe erasing subsidies, it leads to reduced incomes, because if we keep incomes at a constant level and increase taxes, either try to implement maybe housing levy or in salaried people, and also maybe try to implement maybe say the proposed infrastructure fund on salaried people, that leads to reduced incomes. And with that, people tend to revolt against the government because they have less to spend on food, among other things. And also, yeah, food prices have been rising for the longest time. So with protests, it leads to political risk because, yeah, the government has to intervene in this protest. With political risk, we have higher yields. That means high interest rates on public debt. And with higher yields, it leads to public debt distress. And with debt distress, the government has to implement fiscal consolidation. So it's a self-reinforcing loop, which until the government tries to break it, it will keep on happening. So on the left-hand side, it's just an explanation of the figure, which is fiscal consolidation that includes taxes, subsidy cuts or expenditure, cuts in expenditure. It leads to lower disposable income. There's also a demand shock, which involves job losses and service deterioration, which eventually leads to protest and violence. And with protest and violence, you have the political risk crisis, and also which leads to capital flight, that is, and higher yields, which we've seen in the figure. And with higher yields, we have more debt distress. And with more debt distress, for the government to be able to repay its debt, and also keep on providing public goods, it has to perform fiscal consolidation. So this slide just lays out the austerity and rest loop in plain terms. And this is not deterministic, but it's purely policy sensitive. So it's how the government decides to do things, either when they increase revenues or cut on expenditures. At the same time, yeah, it has its effects. We discussed about front-loaded fiscal consolidation, which leads to major shocks and protests. So we've discussed the methodology, we've discussed the scores, and we've also looked at how violence and public finance interact through the debt obligation and also the self-reinforcing loop for fiscal consolidation and protests. So what you have here is the economic impact of violence. And yeah, violence has like huge economic costs. Globally, the cost of violence is 11.6% of GDP. That is, that was close to 19 trillion in 2024. And for Kenya's case, there's the rising political risks, increases borrowing costs, and also reduces foreign direct investments. We've seen, due to policies implemented and also by policies implemented, it's either taxes or regulation of industries. We've seen some companies closing down, some foreign companies closing down in the country. And also in 2024, security spending increased by 20.6 billion. And this was equivalent to 0.9% of GDP. So what we are recommending, instead of the government focusing on the symptoms, trying to beat up protesters, trying to abduct protesters, or maybe silence people, pay some people, they should focus on development, trying to maybe secure a job for youth, because currently over 75% of Kenya's population is youth, and that youth unemployment is at 13%. So meaning it's both an opportunity and a risk for government. The government needs to do something around youth unemployment, and also the policies that the government is implementing, instead of trying to fight protesters and abduct them. And also the opportunity cost in increasing security spending, instead of increasing security spending, which is curing the disease, instead of trying to curb it at the earliest stage, the government should, instead of increasing security spending, that money could have been used to maybe pay lecturers, build classrooms, clinics, or give vaccines. These are some of the roles of the government. So globally, these are the countries with the highest economic costs of economic with the highest cost of violence, economic cost of violence in 2024. At the top, we have Afghanistan with 41.56% as a share of GDP for its economic cost of violence. We have Ukraine, North Korea, Syria. In Africa, our neighbors, we have Somalia. Then we have the Central African Republic, Colombia, Palestinian territories, Burkina Faso, and Cyprus. If you remember, Kenya's score is 10.5%. The economic cost of violence is 10.5% as a share of GDP. These are either direct and indirect direct or indirect costs, either through revenue loss or maybe property destroyed or fleeing, or rather a reduction in FDIs. Then the Sub-Saharan Africa is 13%. Then the global is 11.6%. So Kenya's is slightly below that of the global average. And yeah, the Sub-Saharan Africa is above that of the global average. So the average economic cost of violence is 27.75 for the countries with the highest economic cost of violence. So we try to do a scenario thinking on 3 possible pathways to sustain durable peace in the long run. So we looked at, for Kenya's case, we looked at three possible pathways, that is the spiral, stabilization, and transform pathways. So for the spiral, which I'll say maybe the government has tried to implement this last year. There was continued austerity that was trying to increase revenues and also trying to cut on expenditures. And the institutions in themselves, they're weak, or rather there are gaps in these institutions. This leads to higher unrest and also debt distress. That is the dotted red line on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have the real GDP growth, and the years we're imagining from 2025 to 2028, what will happen under these three scenarios. So with the spiral pathway, that is continued austerity, majorly blind austerity, trying to increase taxes and also cut on expenditure at the same time, and weak institutions leads to high unrest, debt distress, and real GDP growth rates tend to reduce. Then for the stabilization, which is the yellow line at the center, these targeted safeguards. And by targeted safeguards, this is cushioning low-income households and also transparency in government, either through releasing debt contracts, say maybe for the SGR, among other debt contracts, and how the government deals and all its data. What happens in the long run when they try to use the stabilization pathway? There's lower risk premium and also this gradual recovery. It's a good pathway, but it's not the best. The first one, it's not the best at all, the spiral one. Then the sweet spot, that is the transform pathway, this bold human capital push, given the youth population of 75%, the government needs to invest in either skills, trying to increase credit maybe to the youth, among other things. Then political and institutional reforms. And what this achieves in the long run, that there's GDP growth and durable peace. So stabilization, this gradual recovery, like slow GDP growth. But under transform, the GDP growth is quick and there's durable peace. So just to end this presentation, we say that fragility is an economic problem that connects to poverty, governance, and democracy. We've seen the correlation between low growth and fragility. We've seen government ineffectiveness and fragility, how they connect, and also autocracies, how autocracies and fragility correlate. Countries with less democracy tend to have high fragility and vice versa. And also peace and stability are public goods. Governments need to invest in this accordingly. So by peace and stability, we said peace is a public good, and for government to invest in that, it doesn't need to cure the symptom, but it doesn't need to cure the disease, but look at the symptom, which is its fiscal policies, its monetary policies, transparency, among other things. And also the need to avoid blind austerity, that is front-loaded fiscal consolidation, by trying to make huge tax cuts on maybe education. We've seen the education budget was being slashed, I think, this year. And also, finally, just to end the presentation, the key to peacefulness in times of conflict and uncertainty is positive peace. And positive peace is strongly correlated with economic growth. Yeah, thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
I'll just try and sum up very, very quickly. So we've had two presentations more or less saying the same things. The first was basically the OECD's, Vivian took us through the OECD's state fragility indicators or report. And among the things that it showed is basically that the causes of fragility are autocracy. So autocratic governments create fragility. Governments, fragile states are also states that will lack government effectiveness. So they're both an effect and a consequence is government ineffective. So ineffective government governance provisions creates that. And of course, then gender inequality as well is worse. And that's interesting because as we speak about this, one of the things that the arguments that I've been very sympathetic to, but I haven't heard, is that we're talking about the femicide problem in Kenya. However, we measure it and we need to start measuring it properly. One of the things that is not stated to us is the economic consequences or the costs that obtain from extreme personal violence, gender-based violence, or even violence against children and all that. Basically, what these studies have told us is violence is not just, and peace and stability is not just the fact that government says, look, the country is under control. Actually, interpersonal safety is one of the key indicators of the effectiveness of government and one of the things that actually forestalls fragility. So that's one of the things. And then the important one is basically that remittances constitute a large share of GDP for countries that are unstable. So remittances, again, why? Because these are countries that end up displacing own populations, creating insecurity. So you don't not only depress economic growth in the country, but you lead a lot of the human capital to leave and therefore export money, bring back money. And now, while that might look positive, the opportunity costs of that are actually signaling, because you can see of the top 5 countries with the highest remittances, the pretty unstable ones around the African continent. In fact, the first is just our neighbor Somalia and South Sudan. Terrible, terrible, terrible in terms of the stability scores. And notwithstanding that, they have small economies, and of that small economy, they're very externally exposed to remittances, which is people responding to the needs, but obviously that itself is a signal, an indicator of the level of stability or absence of it. So that's the first part. And then the Institute for Economic Peace and the Use of Violence and the Global Peace Index then tells us that basically that instability imposes GDP and fiscal costs, which Maureen took us through, and that positive peace reinforces resilience. And I think the fragility is the absence of resilience in political institutions, social and economic institutions of the state. And that the level of societal safety, so it measures it using 3 things: the level of societal safety, where Kenya performs the weakest, very, very weak. And that again tells you in the security domain, societal safety and security domain, mostly internal. So either government is beating up its people or Kenyans are beating each other, leading to that grotesque score of 2.73. Really, really troubling. Really, really troubling. And with the militarization domain being one of the lowest, which is a good thing, suggesting that Kenya doesn't have military conflicts externally. But thinking about the fact that societal safety and security domain, which is entirely in the control of the domestic interest, domestic policy makers, tells us that economically, socially, politically, There's significant failure in which security is provided, and that Kenya, for all its investments, as Maureen showed, 20% increment in the provision of security forces security or police every year. It's clear that we might call it security, but whether it's a security that delivers stability or reduces the vulnerability to state fragility is a different matter. So obviously there's some thinking to be done. So it's not just about throwing money at it. I think there's a part of it that is entirely how government responds or state institutions respond to the weaknesses by the state itself or pressures delivered by the states itself. As we all know, the sad case of neighbors. We don't know how many people died. I mean, Kenyans have been here before because of elections. Those are not stable instances of stability, and they tell you that yes, there'll be a long walk back and that there are costs for them. As Vivian told us, that unstable states also have three other things. One, they grow slower than others over the medium term, and prosperity is important. Two, when shocks happen, they go deeper, they fall by a great amount, they lack resilience, and they don't recover very, very quickly. So the costs are paid for in low GDP over the long term, trapping people in some kind of poverty. And then you look at Kenya's peace score is higher than sub-Saharan Africa score here. So basically, we can call ourselves an island of peace around an area, but on the whole, even by sub-Saharan African standards, Kenya is not a peaceful country. I mean, Kenya's peace score here is much, much more elevated than others. In fact, the countries that Kenya tends to bear itself against, beg your pardon, such as Mauritius, Botswana, and Ghana, wow, are almost a full standard deviation away from Kenya's performance. So there's a lot to be done by Kenya. And the countries that we are closer to in terms of neighborhoods is South Sudan, Nigeria, Ethiopia, all countries that deserve peace, but certainly are not the examples to emulate in terms of state fragility, I mean state stability and the peace and welfare of private citizens. The data showed that 10.5% of GDP is lost every year in Kenya's case due to violence, direct impact of violence. Now, let me tell you what this means. Now, we're lucky here that it's lower than sub-Saharan Africa, and it's also lower than the global level because there are many more peaceful, dangerous countries across the world, some of which are in full-scale civil war. Regardless of that, it's very high because let me tell you what it means. It is almost equivalent. It's almost equivalent to 50% of all the taxes that government collects every year. Now, I'm not saying this money should go to government as tax. I'm simply saying that all the work the government does squeezing taxes from you and I, from all sources, the amount of cost, the economic cost of violence in Kenya, whether state-driven or private-driven, militia-driven, is equivalent to 50% of the taxes that the government of Kenya collects. That's one way. The second one is it's equivalent to nearly 1.5 months of the total income that all Kenyans earn. It's a very, very serious cost borne by Kenyan households, borne perhaps by the state itself, and borne by farms here. So that's a big cost, and I hope that that is one of the things that tells us. Again, bringing the femicide story, but not just the femicide story, all those stories that we hear, violence against children, silly violence between people, militias, whether for political purposes or those small gangs that continue to, it's telling us that this is a bad signal. And it's not just a bad signal because it will affect or might affect one person's life disproportionately or lead to death, but it's also a fact because it is a drag on the economy. And the worse it becomes, the less likely that Kenya will be able to sustain its growth. So that's, I think, an important thing. And then Maureen talked about one of the things about Kenya as well is an added risk, because Kenya has an added risk because at this time, Kenya is obviously undergoing fiscal distress. And if you already have these elevated levels of economic violence, then you have people coming to the streets to protest. Government might be tempted to think that you can actually clamp down using very violent means. Again, that just makes a situation that is bad worse. I mean, and makes not just makes a situation that is bad worse, but creates even more instability over time. So it's telling us that there are a whole set of tools that are required, institutional tools, tools within families, cultural tools, law, to ensure that economic costs of violence in Kenya are brought back down. And that cannot be done by scaring people with the most atrocious looking machines in the streets, and the accoutrements and costume that policemen would wear, or harsh talk and threats to each other. The government of Kenya has to invest and has to be seen and must be held accountable for ensuring that there's less violence in farms, there's less violence in homes, and there's less violence in the political arena. That is what our two colleagues have been telling us here. So I'll sum up. Apologies for the long summary, but I think they've done a fantastic job, and some of you have already given this. So I'll open at this point to opportunity for all of us to ask questions. So you can ask a question by raising your hand. Also, okay, first, we have an ongoing poll here asking us what you to rate the webinar overall performance in terms of the content. Please do that. But as you do that as well, we will ask you to ask any questions which you can post on the chat box, which is a floating bar menu at the top, or please just raise your hand and I'll call out your name, and then you can switch on your microphone together with your camera and ask the question. Can I have any questions? I haven't seen any questions so far, but I'd be pleased to have any question. Okay, I've seen a response from Ignatius Wamba. Ignatius says very insightful. Thank you very much, Ignatius. I agree with you. My colleagues have tried to raise this question. Anybody else? Christina Yahama has asked, please share the presentation. Okay, it will be shared very immediately after this. A link will be provided immediately after this webinar is over so that you can get it up. You can ask for it. I mean, you can find it on our website. Anyone else with questions or comments? Any question, comments, or a suggestion that you'd have for my two colleagues to consider? Anyone out there? I can see there are 39, 40 of us. Please ask a question or make a comment. Anything that you think was unclear, something that you'd like them to emphasize, or a correction, or a classic, or a source you'd like to have clarified. Yes, who's that? Oh, that's Emmanuel. Yes, Emmanuel, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes. So thank you. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo. I'm from the Institute of Economic Affairs. And my question is, there was a slide where Vivian talked about gender and its relationship to state fragility. I wonder if she can clarify the significance. So just sort of contextualize it again and say how was where did this fit alongside other indicators, and how important is it? Thanks.
Okay, well, as I allow Vivian to answer that question, I hope you had that question, Vivian. The slide is already here. It's slide number 10. It's already on our screen. Vivian, please respond to that, and then Maureen could add whatever she has to, and I'll go to a second round of questions before we can close.
Oh, so when it comes to gender plays a very critical role in reducing fragility. As this is because it strengthens the social, the economic, and political foundations that makes a state resilient. So that is why it matters. So it plays a very critical role in reducing a fragility because it strengthens both social. Remember, the 6 indicators or the 6 dimensions that OECD uses are social, economical, political, and all that. So gender basically strengthens those 6 dimensions, and it is a foundation that makes a country or a state resilient. So that's why it is very important when it comes to fragility. Yeah, thank you.
I think this goes to Maureen. I'm looking at that slide on violence and PFM. If I could get more clarification, because I was expecting to see some connection between economic activities and revenues, and how that will affect their physical deficit. So maybe some clarification.
Sorry, Jairus, could you please clarify your question? I didn't get it clearly.
I'm saying on that slide that you're projecting on violence and PFM, how they interact. I was expecting to see something on low economic growth as a result of violence, and how that affects revenues and the need to borrow more. Or that wasn't part of what you're covering.
Okay, maybe just to review the slide. Okay, just to recap on how violence and public finance interact. So I started off from the debt distress that Kenya has, which is 62 point, which as a share of GDP is at 62.8%. And with the high debt distress that Kenya has, it raises rollover in terms of maturity and the interest rates. And it also raises the debt servicing costs. So with high debt servicing costs, it consumes 76% of revenue, which crowds out public goods and services, which I gave the example of maybe for every 100 shillings paid as revenue, 76 is used to repay debt. And this in itself reduces the amount of money that is used, that is supposed to provide public goods and services. And by public goods, we talk of national security, among other things, and also private goods with positive externalities being education, health. Yes, and when the crowding out happens and maybe development is not happening, that means returns are not generated because with less revenue to spend on public goods and services, meaning most of it is either used in recurrent expenditure and not in development expenditure. So it's sort of a loop that happens. The little that we have is used on recurrent expenditure, less is done on development expenditure, meaning maybe creation of jobs in the public sector is minimal. And also we have the county issues, the transfer delays, and health being devolved. That means the service gaps in things like health, and also the procyclical local austerity, because either they'll delay on payment of salaries, among other things. And just to talk about the economic growth and violence, I talked about the self-reinforcing loop, which starts at fiscal consolidation. When you have the ballooning, or rather the huge debt distress, the government tends to, for the government to be able to run, they either have to increase revenues, cut on expenditures, or perform privatization. And when this happens, some people might lose jobs, or maybe the service deterioration, maybe you go to a hospital and there are no doctors, or maybe people tend to look for jobs in other countries, maybe just as an example. So with job losses, service deterioration, or maybe increased taxes at a constant wage, maybe the wages are still at the same level, that leads to reduced incomes. Then protests, with protests, you have political risk because the government will try to step in to stop the protests and do all manner of things. And with political risk, we have higher yields on debt, huge debt distress, fiscal consolidation. So that's how PFM and violence tend to interact. It's because of the policies, either the taxation or maybe huge expenditure cuts that happen at the start, or maybe job losses, merging of parastatals. All these tend to somehow relate to violence in a country. So that's how more or less economic growth and violence interact, with either having little to spend on public goods and services, either in development or recurrent expenditure, and also the cycle of debt tends to continue. So in short, that's how PFM and violence interact. Of course, there are other factors that cause violence, some being political, among others. But for the purposes of this webinar, we are focusing majorly on PFM, or rather public finance and violence. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Okay, fine. I haven't seen any other questions, but now we'll need to close. So I'll ask, oh yeah, there's a couple of questions here from Dominique. Dominica says, okay, so Ignatius says the research was wonderful. Keep up good work. Thank you very much, Ignatius. We're encouraged by your, we're encouraged by your praise and by acknowledgement of what effort my two colleagues have put in. Thank you very much, and thanks for being here. Now, there's a further question here, right? And it's from Dominique. He says, he asks it of me, but I'll ask my colleagues to respond first. And if they can't, if they do, I'll add my own. On the gender equality and stability question, kindly elaborate using Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Japan. They have high gender inequality while still being unstable. Okay. Jairus, did you want to ask another question as well? Because I still see his hands up. Okay.
No,
all right.
Thank you.
Fine. So let's start now with Maureen and Vivian. Vivian, so you can make. Okay. Emmanuel has another question. Yes, Emmanuel, please go ahead.
Yes. Thanks. So I think it was Maureen who had a slide about 3 scenarios towards the future, and I wanted to know for the transformation scenario, what ideas or concepts around the difficulty, but also the possibility. Like how do you achieve that? What is the political economy of political and one example of one or a couple of reforms that would be required, and then how difficult it would be to overcome them, but how they could be actually achieved. Some ideas. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Maureen. So I hope you've taken that down. And then there's Timothy. Timothy, please raise your hand and just ask your question.
Yeah, my question or clarification is on there's a side about the years of 2000 to 2025 and about the shocks, mostly the 2008 crisis and the COVID, and about the stability of countries. Is it possible just to go through the yes on this? There's something about less or more fragile countries take more time to recover.
Yeah.
My interpretation was more of the access. The international institutions didn't provide the same financing to now these more fragile countries as they did to the OECD countries. Yeah, most of in 2020, SDRs were created, and of course, SDRs tend to be shared more to developed countries than to developing countries. Maybe you can just remind me of your interpretation of this chart.
All right. Okay, so that's Timothy. Okay. Fine. Any other question? Let me see whether there's one more in the chat, and then we'll send it. Okay, I don't see a question. So I don't see a question. So that means Maureen, or rather, Vivian, please go first, and then make your final comments as well. And then Maureen will make the final comments, and then I hope we won't have other questions and we can close. Okay. Fine. Let's go. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Now on this chart, so what I explained, the reason for low recovery and why their GDP is a bit low as compared to the rest is because number one, they are disconnected. They are disconnected to the global financial network. Remember, no country will be able to borrow or to lend money to a fragile country. So basically, they are disconnected to the financial network. And number two is they have limited exposure to global credit flows. So that's why even when it comes to recovery and all that, they take a long time because of their state of fragility. So they have that limited exposure to global credit. So that is what I'll add on to that. Thank you very much and for listening to us, and I believe it has been insightful to all of us. Thank you very much.
Right, Maureen?
Thank you. I'd like to answer Emmanuel's question on the scenario thinking. For the transform, we talked about bold human capital push and political and institutional reforms. So your question, I think, yes, you can remember clearly, it was majorly on how to maybe an example of political and institutional reforms, as well as a suggestion on how it can be done despite maybe the challenges that come with it. So for the political and institutional reforms, we have maybe electoral reforms, strengthening of democracy. We've seen democracy being a huge component, and there's a positive correlation between high democracy and less fragility. So for Kenya's case, maybe proper implementation of the Constitution of Kenya and also independence of institutions. The executive acting independently, the judiciary acting independently, and also the parliament acting independently, and also the independent commission acting on their own to make sure the rule of law is implemented. I believe this will push the political and institutional reforms in the country, and also, eventually we'll achieve GDP growth and durable peace. And I think Vivian has addressed the other question. And okay, the question on Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Japan, I think Kwame will handle that. Just to give my final remarks, Kenya's ranking on both fragility as well as the peace index. It's not a verdict, but a warning light on Kenya being at a high warning on the FSI, and also at the 127th position on the Global Peace Index, as well as being less peaceful than the Sub-Saharan Africa average. This just points to the symptoms that needs to be cured instead of increasing the military budget or security budget. So this just points out to a lot of work that needs to be done by the government to make sure peace exists. Because yes, we agree that Kenya is resilient. It's bounced back from different challenges, including election violence, COVID, droughts, among other things. But peace remains an asset that the government is not fully investing in it, and maybe that's the thing that the government needs to invest in to spiral economic growth. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Okay, thank you. So Timothy, I hope that gave the answer. But the point was, yes, the point was that, and you, I think in your thinking by saying that, look, funds were not available for the purposes of of funding them through the shocks. That's the exact point, because they're fragile, resources are not available in time. It therefore keeps them, the effect of a shock is actually much worse and much deeper, and therefore recovery is much slower. So I guess that's one of the explanations as well. So that being fragile to begin with also exposes you to disadvantages about whether assistance will be available and whether it will be sufficient or come on time to help with the funding across a shock. Now, the Chris has asked a question that is important, and he's asked a question about, look, let me just make sure I read it again. On the gender equality and stability, kindly elaborate using Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Japan. They have higher gender inequality while still being stable. Very true, Chris. But Saudi Arabia, Japan, and UAE all have one advantage. They are all upper income societies. So that's one. And high income itself has a stabilizing effect. Even if in the case of Saudi Arabia and UAE, that high income comes from natural resources. Regardless of that, they've used it well, and actually that helps to stabilize society. However, I just had to look at this. One of the things that my colleagues brought to my attention yesterday is that female labor participation for Saudi Arabia is the lowest of the three, but that it's actually been going up, so that in the last 5 years, it has moved up from 19% to about 30, close to double, about 34, 36%. So already that pressure to shift the economy to ensure that high income status is maintained and welfare continues is already being felt, and part of the adjustments are being done by, of course, to a large extent by the reforms being initiated by Mohammed bin Salman, regardless of what other things, the challenges that the country faces. So that's one. UAE, on the other hand, has actually had a more focused, they're trying to orient the economy internationally. And one of the things that does then is to actually make sure that the women who are educated, especially in high service sectors, you actually find women in education, even in medicine, of course, with some constraints still, but you still find that women participation in the labor force is high. The problem case is Japan. As we say, Japan's stability is covered to a large extent by its being a very homogeneous society, but also by the fact that it's a high-income society, and has had that for more than, I think, 3 generations now. Now, what that does is it allowed Japan to keep women outside the labor force for long. But you know that for the last 20 years, Japan has been revolving around a very marginal, actually anemic growth rate. So it's clear that the absence of women participation in the labor force especially is undermining its vitality and its possibility for growth. And that pressure is already evident in. But the gender inequalities here are with access to jobs necessarily, not necessarily with respect to vulnerability to violence, not any more than in other parts, which is what the peace and fragility indices tell you would happen. So that's basically the story. So what you're seeing here is that all 3 countries are mediated by the fact, regardless of what the industrial base is, they have high incomes that provides a stabilizing function, and that's facts. So seeking high incomes is an important thing, because one of the things it does, it also stabilizes society. It does not necessarily resolve the gender contradictions, but over time, it makes it inevitable that those reforms have to happen. And all 3 countries that we've mentioned here are in very different forms of reform, even though the economic structures are also very different. Japan has obviously the more complex economy, and it's the constraint of gender is actually becoming more evident and clear. So that's one. Saudi Arabia is the laggard of the 3, but at the same time, the pressures are already available, and you're seeing the pressure towards releasing more women into the labor force, allowing them to be able to drive, allowing them to go to some places unaccompanied, to work in establishments after the home is already happening. By having a large service sector, the UAE already started that transition about 20 years ago. So yes, it is still telling us the same story. But you're right, that these are countries that are cushioned, their stability, which is very high levels, are cushioned to a very large extent by the fact that they have much higher incomes, and that has allowed them to delay to some extent gender access to labor markets than other countries are. That is a luxury that a country such as Kenya and most of sub-Saharan Africa cannot afford, fortunately. So, ladies and gentlemen, Thank you very much for being here. And I'd like us to thank my two colleagues, Vivian, an assistant program officer in our popular economics program, and Maureen, a program officer in our popular economics program, who's prepared this presentation. The function of this is to help us understand why peace and state stability, which is not the same as regime stability, or is not the same as police threatening people or a strong military by itself, are important. And they're just important in the normative sense, which my colleagues take as a given, but they're important for the fact that you can follow specific metrics which show that they're consistent with sustained economic growth and a vital economy over time, and therefore for people's welfare. So on behalf of the IE, I thank you very much for being here, for attending our meetings. We are very honored that you're here and you sat with me. I'd like to propose that we just give clap to my two colleagues. That stated, as for the rest of you, we are very thankful for that you've supported the IEA's work for today, and we hope that this has been useful for you. You can send us any questions or any proposal about a question you'd like us to clarify or to discuss here. And if any of you has an area in which you think your specific expertise would help with helping a conversation like this, and you'd like us to involve you in, we'd be pleased to do that. The IEA is an organization of members, professional members. We'll be having an AGM sometime at the end of this month. And if you'd like to be a member and participate in that, I welcome you as well. I thank my colleagues in our IT teams who've managed to keep this here today, sent the invitations to you. We are thankful that you responded. And please send invitations in the future to other colleagues of yours who would like to attend this. This webinar will be placed in our archives in our YouTube page and account. So you search for it if you'd like to study it once again. And if you have other questions that you'd like to, please send it to us. And we'd like to continue to have conversations that are important for Kenya's prosperity, regional prosperity, and global prosperity. Thank you very much and have a good day.